There was a young boy named Pavl who was very stupid. He lived in a small city in Russia called Shel Abinsk. One day, Pavl was sitting at his desk in school, staring out the window. He tried to listen to what his teacher was saying, but it was just too boring. Everything she said went in one ear and out the other. When the bell rang to signal the end of class, all of the other children leaped out of their seats and ran out the door. Just as he was about to leave, Pavl dropped his pencil and it rolled under his desk. He got down on his hands and knees to look for it. Just then, he heard a strange noise. It was a loud creaking sound. When Pavl looked up to see what it was, his eyes almost popped out of his head. The teacher was standing at the front of her classroom, unscrewing her head. She twisted it around and around until it popped out of her neck. Then, she lifted her head off her shoulders and held it in her hands. Pavl was so terrified that he let out a little squeak of fear. The teacher suddenly turned and held her head up in the air. "Who's there?" she snapped. Pavl slowly stood up. His hands were shaking and his knees were trembling. In a threatening voice, the teacher hissed, "Come tonight to the cemetery." Frightened out of his wits, Pavl quickly ran home. When he got to his house, he tried to think. Who could he tell? Who would believe him? Pavl was not a very smart boy, and he needed to ask someone for help, but his mother and father were no use. They were even more stupid than he was. The only person in his family with a little bit of sense was his older sister, Ulia, so he decided to ask her for advice. She listened carefully while he told her everything that had happened that day. When he was finished, she thought for a few moments and said, "Dress up all in green, and when you get to the cemetery, lie down and hide in the grass." That night, the boy followed his sister's instructions. He put on a green shirt, green pants, and green shoes. Then he walked to the graveyard and lay down in the tall grass. A few minutes later, he saw his teacher walk through the cemetery gates. She stood in front of the tombstones, raised her hands in the air and shouted, and suddenly, all of the dead bodies rose up out of their graves and knelt down in front of her. She ordered them to find the boy. They searched through the cemetery, looking for him, but they couldn't find him because he was well hidden in the tall grass. The next day at school, the teacher stared at Pavl. Her eyes were simmering with rage. When the school bell rang and all the other children filed out of the classroom, she grabbed Pavl roughly by the arm and hissed, "Come tonight to the cemetery." He nodded his head and ran all the way home. The boy waited for his older sister to come home and asked her what he should do. Ulia thought for a few moments and said, "Dress up all in black, and when you get to the cemetery, lie down and hide in a puddle." That night, the boy followed his sister's instructions. He put on a black shirt, black pants, and black shoes, and he walked to the graveyard and lay down in a big puddle. A few minutes later, he saw his teacher walk through the cemetery gates. Once again, she stood in front of the tombstones, raised her hands in the air, and shouted, and suddenly, all of the dead bodies rose up out of their graves and knelt down in front of her. She ordered them to find the boy. They searched through the cemetery, looking for him, but they couldn't find him because he was well hidden in the big puddle. The next day at school, the teacher was staring at Pavl even more intently. She was grinding her teeth in anger and frustration. When class finished for the day, she grabbed him again and said the same thing, "Come tonight to the cemetery." He ran home and went up to Yulia's bedroom to ask her for advice. However, he was horrified to learn that she had gone to visit their grandmother and wouldn't be back until the next morning. He didn't know what to do. Finally, in desperation, he went to his mother for advice. She listened as he told her everything that had happened. When he finished, she thought for a few moments and said, "Dress all in brown, and when you get to the cemetery, lie down in a grave." That night, the boy followed his mother's instructions. He put on a brown shirt, brown pants, and brown shoes. Then he walked to the graveyard and lay down in an open grave. A few minutes later, he saw his teacher walk through the cemetery gates. Yet again, she stood in front of the tombstones, raised her hands in the air, and shouted, "Animate." Suddenly, all of the dead bodies rose up out of their graves. Beneath him, Pavl felt the earth shifting and moving. Cold dead hands reached up out of the soil and wrapped around his neck. Screaming in horror, he tried to struggle, but it was too late. The corpse had him in its clutches and its hands closed tighter around his neck until they squeezed the life out of him.